You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Public transport's great.
What's not great is that unless you've got a radio with you, you can't listen to 3CR when you're on it.
Until now. The Community Radio Plus app lets you listen to us wherever you are.
Get on board and search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.
Time's on my mind when I had you by my side. Am I thinking loud? Do I want you around? Minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction. In the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning. Death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. My name is Joseph Toscano. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. And if you're listening to this program anywhere in Australia, it's courtesy of those nice people at the Community Radio Network. If you wonder what anarchy is all about, anarchos without rulers. Not without rules, without rulers. What gives rulers the ability to determine the lives of billions of people? Inequalities in power and wealth. So the anarchist struggle is the struggle to devolve and share power, possibly through direct democratic means, and the struggle to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. Simple, conservative concepts. And the problem is, those who exercise authority and wealth in their hands will do everything in their power, both legal and illegal, to try to prevent us, you and me, from living a life in a society based on equal decision-making power and equal distribution of wealth. That's what it's about. So if you're not interested in those concepts, I'm sure there's plenty of things you can do today and tomorrow and the day after. But if you're interested in maybe a different, I don't use the word alternative, we are not an alternative, we are a different way of looking at things, I encourage you to keep listening to the Anarchist World This Week. If you do find yourself in Melbourne town, that's right, Melbourne town, on Wednesday the 5th of February, I encourage you to come along to the Footscray Hotel at 48 Hopkins Street in Footscray to listen to a presentation I'll be doing on that radical, activist, social reformer, Vida Goulstein. In other words, Vida Goulstein. So, a fascinating human being, lived from 1869 to 1949. Suffragette, internationalist, pacifist, editor, writer, extraordinary radical activist. Most people know her through her work as a suffragette, but ultimately she had many more arrows to her bow, and we will look at all those areas of her life. So that's on tonight, and if you can't make it, hopefully we'll be able to put it on video, and you'll be able to access the video on josephtoscano.nam in the next week or so. You know, life's funny. You know, I find it hilarious. There's all these serious things going on in the world. We're told there's a crime wave, in Australia. People think, more jails. And then guess what? They've done it. The creator of Pam the Bird, has been, well, somebody who supposedly created Pam the Bird has been arrested by the Victoria Police. Here we are, graffiti artist, arrested in court for a little bit of fascinating, hilarious graffiti around the streets of Melbourne. Pam the Bird. And it gets even more ridiculous. The court case is on currently, so I'm not going to comment on the court case, but I did find it a little bit amusing that VicPol, of all the problems they're facing, corporate crime, gangland violence, tobacco wars, increasing violence on the streets of Melbourne, the rise of the neo-Nazi threat, that they've put so much effort and money into finding, in their opinion, who the perpetrator is of Pam the Bird. And they're even going to get the FBI involved to hack into a Instagram site, which I understand has 75,000 followers. Now, I'm not a fan of Pam the Bird, but what I am a fan of is the way that the state has reacted to this. Fascinating. Interesting to see the court case roll out, and I'll keep you informed. It'll be interesting to see what the ultimate penalty is. Yep. The Flinders station clock will never be the same. But let's go on to things a little bit more beefy that concern you and me. Now, I've noticed that the buffoon, the president of the US of A, is kind of trying to shake down people. When you shake down people, you come up to a person, you say, empty your pockets. Show us what's in your pockets. And he's doing it to, weak people around the place, Canada, Mexico, Panama, you name it, with a reasonable degree of success. And it's all about balance of trade. The buffoon's a little bit concerned. Then some people are making hay at the expense of the United States of America, well, corporate America. Let's not forget he's not that interested in the little people. So, although the little people think he is interested in them, and that's the hilarity of it all. It is hilarious to be alive in 2025, but we'll look about that later on. Now, I have noticed that in Australia there is a trade deficit between the USA and Australia. And that trade deficit is in the USA's Bailey courts, 2-1. For every dollar we export, that's the country, not me, but I don't export anything, and I'm sure you don't either. Well, maybe you do. For every dollar that we export to the US of A, the US of A exports $2 to little old Australia. So there is a trade deficit there. And I'm recommending that the Albanese-led Labor government and possibly the Dutton-led Liberal National Party government in the future, you like that? The Dutton-led Liberal Party National Government. Hilarity. The trouble is jokes tend to be elected, as we've seen with the buffoon. So I'm recommending we put on tariffs on USA imports into little old Australia to ensure there is no imbalance in the trading relationship between these two sovereign nation states. Now, I'm sure you're falling over and you haven't heard anybody else talk about it, but this is the idiocy of it. This is how ridiculous this is. It's not about protecting local industries, but about this so-called balance of trade deficit. So it's good for the, if good for the gander, it's good for the goose, or is it the other way around? No, good for the gander, good for the goose, or is it good for the goose and good for the gander? Who knows? But again, ridiculous. Totally ridiculous. And somehow I've got to waste my time and your time trying to explain what this is all about. Well, obviously it's all about entrenching and expanding USA interests. Simple. Well, the buffoon has never made a, fist of it. He's never said that it isn't, but that's what it's all about. So isn't it about time the rest of the world developed a backbone? Why don't we, as a people, lead the way and impose tariffs on USA imports until there's parity in terms of import and export? Well, you may laugh, but this is the situation we find ourselves in 2025, where lunacy reigns. Talking about lunacy, I understand that the buffoon has invited a war criminal who has an arrest warrant issued against him by the International Criminal Court to the White House. Well, it's felon with felon, isn't it? Let's not forget that the President of the USA is a felon. So we got felon with felon shaking hands and trying to determine the lives, the future of the Palestinian people that find themselves in occupied territories in the state of Israel. Extraordinary. What an extraordinary world. I don't see him inviting Mr. Putin, another war criminal, with an arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court, being invited to the White House. I assume that'll occur very, very simply. And why can the buffoon, I was going to actually use his name, wash out your mouth with soap and water, Joe? Why is the buffoon able to, invite an indicted war criminal to the White House? Because the United States of America does not recognise the International Criminal Court. Because obviously they're exceptional. We do. So next time, maybe if Miss Dutton becomes Prime Minister and invites the person who's got an arrest warrant against him, the Prime Minister of Israel, to Australia to address the Australian Parliament, maybe you and I could do a citizen's arrest. Who knows? But I think what's important is we've got to look at Israel's long game as far as the Palestinians is concerned. And it's about perpetuating a state of permanent war. Permanent war to ultimately drive out the Palestinian population from the occupied territories in East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank. And if you think that I'm hallucinating, think again. There are now 1 million Israeli settlers entrenched in the West Bank. Gaza is in ruins, and every day more incursions are made by the Israeli state into East Jerusalem. So this is a long game. And for the buffoon to fall for that is a bit of a sad commentary on the state of affairs in 2025. Permanent war. Permanent war designed to drive the Palestinians out of the occupied territories. And that's the key word, occupied territories. Territories that were occupied to a significant degree after the 1967 war, not during the creation of the initial state of Palestine. And here we have the buffoon welcoming another felon who's been indicted of charges by International Criminal Court of War Crimes. What a world we live in. And that brings me to the next issue I'm interested in. Now, obviously, the rise of anti-Semitism, and it's always been a feature of Western societies. We saw that during World War II, because it wasn't the Palestinians who were responsible for the Holocaust. It was Nazi Germany and their supporters around Europe who were responsible for the Holocaust, but the Palestinians have been asked to pay the price, which they're paying every day. But we've seen resolutions go through the Australian Parliament which have condemned the rise of anti-Semitism in this country, and we've seen Mr Dutton, the Prime Minister in waiting, politicising the struggle against anti-Semitism as a weapon, weaponised it against the Albanese-led Labor Party. And obviously, people like you and me would support, things against the rise of anti-Semitism, because the rise of anti-Semitism, it doesn't come from Palestinians or their supporters. The rise of anti-Semitism in this country, the Pandora's box has been opened for two reasons. One is the brutality of the Israeli response to the Hamas massacres on the 7th of October, and the fact that those of you who watch a little bit of TV or videos and stuff, you can see that after 15 long months of atrocities, Hamas is still in control of Gaza. But getting back to the situation here in this country, so in many regards, the very people who are responsible for increasing anti-Semitic attacks in this country are the very people we have been warning Australians about over the last few decades. The fact there are people in our society who are more than happy to marginalise and exploit sections of the community to promote their own pathetic visions of tomorrow. So I'd also like to see another resolution passed in the Australian Parliament, which I'm sure won't be passed or even put up as an agenda item. The fact that we pass a resolution not only condemning the rise of anti-Semitism, but a resolution condemning the indicted war criminals who now lead the State of Israel. What's good for the goose is good for the gander, as they keep saying. So, let's see what happens. Now, I did find it amusing. Yes, it is. There's a lot of funny things happening in the world today. I mean, they may be serious, but you've got to make them amusing, because the way to take down those in authority is to make them objects of scorn. Objects of scorn. Objects of disgust. The old emperor has no clothes type of campaign. Now, I did notice that our own Rupert, the man who gave up his Australian citizenship to become a US citizen a few decades ago in order to expand his business empire, sitting at the same table as the buffoon. Because it's Rupert, Fox News and all his associated media networks that have been responsible for creating the climate which convinced the American people that electing the buffoon was the way forward as far as their future was concerned. And that makes me think about the Fourth Estate. That's right, the Fourth Estate. in Australia. Now, if you're wondering what the fourth estate is, well, you know, you've got Parliament and the Senate and all that. But the fourth estate is basically the media in all its forms, whether it's social media, whether it's corporate-owned media, whether it's the government-gelded ABC. And it's interesting that the 24-hour news cycle, you like that word, the 24-hour news cycle, has made us, not you and me, but has made the media networks so hungry for content that they move from subject to subject to subject to subject without any analysis, let alone in-depth analysis of what's happening. So people like the aspiring Prime Minister in waiting, the Right Honourable Mr Peter Dutton, can make the most outrageous comments and they disappear within a few hours. It's just extraordinary. Nobody in the fourth estate seems to have the capacity or the ability to actually impale people on their policies by asking questions which have some impact. There is a federal election around the corner, most likely in mid to late April. If the fourth estate can't get its act together today, what's the point? What's the point? They have become cheerleaders for that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And that's the key. They own the mechanisms of communication. And the Australian Broadcasting Corporation is browbeaten into becoming an inferior clone of the corporate networks. And every time, as we've seen with a current court case regarding unfair dismissal from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, every time a presenter or a producer wants to raise issues which cause a little bit of tension, they find themselves working in a backroom position. They find themselves not working for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And more importantly, we see an institution which is paid for the taxpayer now being so browbeaten, so broken, that all they can do is mouth the same opinions as the corporate sector. I'm not talking about their lifestyle programs. I'm not talking about their original productions. I'm talking about their political analysis, the people they interview, how they interview them, who becomes a presenter, and more importantly, who becomes a producer, who becomes part of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation network. And that's the reality that we face in 2025 with an upcoming election in this country. This election, if they have it their way, is going to be reduced to a contest between two men, Albanese and Dutton. And one man, Mr Dutton, will have 99% of the corporate media cheering for him and his inane, ridiculous policies which nobody's willing to question, while those elements of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation that are trying to do their job as political analysts will find themselves pushed around, not supported by the institution. Think of the situation of poor old Stan Grant, who resigned after he was targeted by extreme right-wing fascist elements to the extent that him and his family were threatened. And he had to go to a police station to make a complaint. His employer couldn't give a shit, didn't care, wouldn't raise their hands up. Just an extraordinary situation when you think about it. So if you think that the fourth estate, both the legacy media, the corporate-owned media and the government-gelded ABC, and the bot-ridden social media is somehow going to give you options and a debate about various candidates and various policy initiatives in this country, think again. The fourth estate has become part of the problem, not the solution to the problem. It is nothing more than a parasite on the people of this country. You listen to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. My name is Justus Garner. I'm hosting today's program. You can leave pleasant messages on 0439 395 489. You can email me at info@pipsy.net. This is the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia, streaming live on 3cr.org.au. It's broadcast across Australia, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. You can access this program by going to 3cr.org.au. Well. Fascinating, isn't it? No costings, no policies. Trust me. That seems to be the theme of the 2025 federal election. Trust me. Now, I've seen some inane campaigns in my 73-year history in this country. I remember the yellow fret campaign of the 60s with the map of Asia and yellow arrows pointing to Australia. I remember that. I remember other inane campaigns over the years, tons of inane campaigns. But the fact is that ultimately we get the political system we deserve. We don't live in a dictatorship. I'm able to broadcast today because I'm basically totally irrelevant as far as the mainstream political framework is concerned. You're irrelevant as far as they're concerned if you listen to the Anarchist World This Week. But the fact is, although there are hundreds of laws which restrict free expression, and the fact there are no constitutional protections for free expressions in this country except during an election campaign period, the fact is that currently it's becoming more and more difficult to actually promote anything in this country. Now, we have an election campaign coming up. Well, we've had a phony election campaign for the last 6 to 8 weeks, where different leaders, spout different policies. No costings, no policies. We'll tell you after the election. Trust us. Trust us. We're here to look after your interests. We're here to ensure that inflation comes down. We're here to ensure that Australia continues to be the greatest country on planet Earth since the creation of the earth, by God, the gods. We're here to ensure that this country remains an egalitarian community. This is the greatest country on earth, the land of milk and honey. My God, what a load of crap. What a load of garbage. Oh, yes, and don't forget, we have a cost of living crisis for some. for some. Remember, interest rate increases have maximal impact on those with the least. And the goods and services tax has greatest impact on those with the least in this country. That's the reality. And we have a federal election which will be decided on nothing. You see, there is a wonderful thing about parliamentary democracy or representative democracy. It's a wonderful thing, and I'll tell you what it is. Now, if I did this as a business, tactic, I'd find myself in all types of court situations defending myself. But as far as parliamentary democracy, it's a very simple concept, right? We have a fake debate because the means of communication are basically held in the hands of a minuscule minority who use those means of communication to reinforce their power and wealth. That's the reality you face and I face every day of the week, right? We have this particular situation. Then, right, we're told that we can change our leaders every 3 years. Fair enough. But what is an election? What is the essence of an election? I make some promises, and I will make some promises, right? If I'm not elected, which I won't be, well then, those promises evaporate. But if you're elected and you become the government of the day, you are then in a position to implement those promises. But the problem is, if those election promises you made during the election process somehow impinge on the power and wealth of that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, well then you will not be able to deliver those promises. But the beauty about the coalition, especially the Liberal Party of the coalition, the beauty is they are there working for the man. They are the prison guards. They will deliver lock, stock and barrel to that 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, irrespective of all the wonderful promises they make, like allowing small businesses to claim $20,000 of tax deduction if they take their staff to lunch. I wonder if you take them overseas. Maybe you could put them on a plane, take them overseas to Paris for a nice lunch and then claim the 20 grand. Good idea. I'll need to think about that in the future. I'm sure somebody will do it, but we can actually have packages we could organise for them. But the thing is, look, I can promise you anything I like, and if I'm elected into government, and that's the key, if I'm in a position to determine the parliamentary agenda, if I'm in a position to determine what legislation will go through Parliament, I do not have to keep one of my promises. Not one. And you as the elector, you know what you can do? You can jump up and down, you can walk around, you can cry, you can beseech, you can beg, but at the end of the day, nothing happens. And that's why we find ourselves in this situation in 2025. Now, I've been around a long time, and I'm sure many of our listeners have been around a long time, and a few of them haven't been around a long time. But the reality is, the reality we face today is no different to the reality we faced 50 years ago. But there is one important difference regarding that reality. 50 to 60 years ago, people were not willing to stand on the sidelines. They were not willing to wait for the crumbs brushed off the corporate table. And what we saw is the major political parties taking on policies which did, in some cases, make a difference. like the introduction, social security benefits for single mothers. That didn't occur till the election of the Whitlam Labor government in 1972. 3 tertiary education for everybody. No-fault divorce. The introduction of a universal healthcare system, in those days called Medibank, today called Medicare. Introduction of funding for legal aid centres. Introduction of funding, federal funding for women's refuges. Now, obviously, it wasn't hunky-dory, but the fact is there was the pressure from below for change. There's an old saying, on the brink of revolutionary change, reforms, you're covered with a shower of reforms. The greater the pressure which is applied on that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, the greater the number of reforms that are introduced. Now, unfortunately, in this country, the land of milk and honey, the so-called egalitarian community, we've had a problem in the last few decades because people have forgotten that change comes from people banding together, taking action, demanding that change occurs. If you look at the policies of the Australian Labor Party today, they're actually very similar in many regards to the policies which were introduced by the Liberal government, the Menzies-led Liberal government. And if you look at the policies of the Liberal Party today, they have nothing in common with the basic elements of what the Liberal Party was all about when it was formed by Menzies in the 40s. Extraordinary situation. The Liberal Party is not Liberal and the Labor Party is not Labor. It's a little bit like going into a supermarket and you're trying to save some money and you're looking for the generic brands. What we have in Australia today is generic politics. Same veneer. Minimal difference. Generic politics. And we have generic politics for one very good reason. Because we have forgotten as a people that change comes from pressure, comes from action. It doesn't come from minuscule groups taking spectacular action which creates pandemonium in the community. All that does is create a stronger state for a more repressive state apparatus through the introduction of more and more repressive laws. And we have seen this consistently in this country. Consistently. The introduction of more and more oppressive laws. Because you see, under the Australian Constitution, you don't really have many rights. You have 4, and I'll try to remember them because they're a little bit minuscule, but I'll try to remember them. You got freedom of religion. That's a constitutional right. You've got the power to be compensated if the federal government takes over your property. You got that. There is one anti-discriminatory feature of the Australian Constitution which I love. You cannot be discriminated against based on the state you live in. Yeah, you like that? Forget about the rest of the discrimination. Just that's one. And there's one more which escapes me. It's so important. So the reality is that whoever holds a majority in the House of Parliament can basically, under the Australian Constitution, pass any law they like, as long as the majority supports it. Now, a lot of people think the democracy is majority rule. So if the majority decides that blue-eyed 2-year-olds are the spawn of the devil and they should be exterminated, does that make that right? If the majority decides, as they've done in this past, in this country, that people whose skin may be a little bit dark don't really belong here, is that right? If the majority decides that people involved in atypical sexual activity, well, let's call it people involved in who sexual activity goes beyond consensual heterosexual activity are somehow deviants, and we should pass laws against them, as we had a few decades ago. Does that make it right? Well, obviously it's not. So democracy isn't majority rule. It's more than that. It can be majority rule within a constitutional framework which protects minority opinions and minorities from exploitation by majorities, because majorities can be, as we've seen in the land of the brave and the three, led by the buffoon, can actually be manipulated into supporting people who have nothing to do as far as their security of their future is concerned. So democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged public. And that's the key. By an engaged public. And if we decide to sit back and do nothing, then if you live in a society where there are no constitutional arrangements which protect the individual from the arbitrary exercise of state power, then you will see legislation be passed into law which will restrict and remove the rights minorities enjoy. That's the reality of living in a parliamentary democracy with no constitutional protections. That's the reality of living in a society which is dominated by a single economic philosophy or ideology. And that's what we find today, not just in Australian society, but most of the world, including the so-called communist world. We see capitalism, whether it's run by the state or by individuals or corporations, capitalism, private investment for private profit, as the determining mode, determining philosophy, ideology, even religion in any society. Private investment for private profit. And we're told that somehow that if we allow this unfettered animal, as if it's got life, to breed, that somehow, we'll all enjoy the crumbs that are brushed off the corporate table. So I could go on for time immemorial, okay? You know that, I know that. I can talk about the deficiencies in the current system. I can talk about the deficiencies in the parliamentary system, the deficiencies as far as the electoral process is concerned. I can talk till the cows come home or the sacred cows turn up again, But the fact is, I'm just one individual. One individual talking to you. One person. I'm talking directly to you. We can sit back and wait for the second coming, We can be armchair critics. It's so easy to be an armchair critic. Oh, you're not doing it the way they did it in 1937. Well, it's not 1937, it's 2025 and things have changed. You know, you can be an internet warrior, a cyber warrior, getting RSI of your forefinger. Click, 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 click. Love, 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 love. But the reality is that change still comes from feet on the street. Feet on the street. And while we are consumed by financial issues, while we're consumed with hatred for minorities who don't actually have any power, they can exercise power, while we're consumed by nationalism, love of country, while we're consumed by the next sporting feature, we're the best in the world, and we're not consumed with the realities of everyday existence and how to change it, nothing will change. As the Israeli government is finding out, you're not going to destroy Palestinian efforts to self-determination through a military process. It needs to be a negotiated process. It's the same in Australia. As economic inequality grows, and on every available indicator it has grown, as economic inequality grows, social dislocation increases and entrenched privilege is cemented into the DNA of society. And that's what we have in Australia in 2025. Entrenched privilege due to growing economic inequality. And you know, and I know, there's something not quite right in the land of milk and honey, the land which is portrayed as the greatest nations since the creation of, since Homo sapiens destroyed their Neanderthal neighbours. The fact is that the rhetoric-reality gap, the difference between what we hear and what we experience is growing. Because in every available indicator in this country, the gap between the have and the have-nots is growing. And the fact is that the giant middle, the 50 to 60% of the population which form the middle, have now become hostages to a financial system which ensures they'll be enslaved for generations, paying off things like a roof over their heads. That's the reality for an increasing number of Australians, not just the 30% who rely on social security benefits to survive, but the 50 to 60% who are in paid employment, who find at the end of the week that very few have enough disposable income to enjoy the fruits that the investment class, the 8% of Australians who've got enough disposable income to invest, have. And that's the reality. So the reality is very different to the rhetoric. And that's why we have growing dissatisfaction. But that dissatisfaction in society is not channeled into political action. It's not channeled into political action. That dissatisfaction in society is channeled into political and social and cultural movements that divide us on the basis of whether we're First Nations people or not, on the basis of whether, we're white or black or yellow or brindle or green or pink, on the basis of our religious or non-religious beliefs, on the basis of our gender. So we spend all our time fighting each other. And that's what the culture wars have been about. Fighting each other, not for our benefit, but for the benefit of a shrinking number of people who own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And that's the reality you and I face every day. Every day. And the growth of this so-called right-wing, extreme, whatever you like to call it, movement, which we see sweeping Europe and the US of A and possibly next this country, is a direct consequence of people being sucked into this reality that has nothing to do with what's actually going on in the world, this fake, I'm going to use the word fake reality. Because the reality is very different to the rhetoric. We don't live in an egalitarian community. When you have a private charity begging for money to send 1.5 million Australian children living in poverty to public schools, which are theoretically free, you know there's a problem. When you have people spending decades of their lives paying off a mortgage, you know there's a problem. When you're finding that when you start off your working life with a HECS debt because you've taken the time to obtain qualifications and degrees which will, in the end, be of benefit to the community and society, you know there's a problem. When you see the growth of the power of billionaires in our society, you know there's a problem. When you see our natural resources being stripped out of the earth with nothing going to First Nations people and hardly anything coming back to the population as a whole in taxation revenue, you know there's a problem. When you have a goods and services tax whose major impact is on the poorest elements of society, you know there's a problem. And that's the issue we face every day. The fact is there are problems. And to many degrees, they are of our own making because we have allowed this to happen. There's no point me blaming the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. They're doing what we as a people have allowed them to do. We have fallen for the furphy, the old furphy, that what's good for the gander isn't good for the geese. We've fallen for that old furphy. Every day we fall for that old furphy. Every day. Every day. We find ourselves in this particular situation. So ultimately, it doesn't matter how old you are, how young you are, what you're doing, ultimately, a democracy is not just rule of the people, by the people, for the people. It's about by an engaged public. And if we think the political process has nothing to do with us, then we will get the governments we deserve. So I encourage you to look at what you're doing in your life and decide what's important and what isn't important. Because ultimately, if you want change, and obviously you may not want change, you may be happy in the situation you find yourself in, but ultimately if you want change, especially radical change, especially change which leads to the devolution of power and the use of the Commonwealth for the common good, well then it's time that we, as individuals, began to work together to make those necessary changes. If you look at the difference between the 1970s, the early 1970s, and 2025, it's the engagement of people in the political, social, cultural process of this country. The engagement of a growing number of us in that process is what will lead to change. Thank you for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. This program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au You can email me at info@pibci.net or info@anarchistmedia.org. You can leave messages on 0439 395 489. Yes, you can write letters to Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. Listen to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station next week. That's right, next week. It's the best time to listen to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's Sacred Cow Slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to The Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
You might have heard about the Community Radio Plus app, but it's only when you start using it that you'll wonder how you lived without it.
You can listen to us wherever you are, at home, work, driving.
On public transport, gardening, protesting, or even in the bath.
Just search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.